Hey friends, we call today's episode Dealing with a Crisis in Life, and we're going to be looking at John chapter 18 verses 1 through to 27. So I'm speaking about crises today. Crises, as I define them, are unavoidable events that cause distress and for some even trauma. Now if you're a parent, you very soon learn on that crises are inevitable. Maybe your child comes running in one day screaming, covered in blood, and in that moment the gut reaction is to panic. You're not sure what's happened. You're paralysed for a second by fear, shock, and countless questions might race through your mind. Will the child be okay? Will they be scarred for life? In some cases, tragically, you might even wonder if the accident is so serious, are they going to survive this? Thankfully, for most of us, those childhood incidences that I think every parent experiences are minor incidents. But as the child grows, the crises can become more serious. When at the age of 17, I traded up from riding a bicycle to riding a motorcycle, it caused my parents a lot of anxiety. I suppose my interest in motorcycle racing probably gave them good reason to have anxiety about how I might approach my motorcycle riding on the public roads. And of course, they understood the potential outcome of an accident was now much more severe. A bicycle accident, of which I must admit I had many as a child and as a teenager, required nothing more usually than a band-aid and some sympathy. However, a motorcycle accident could be something much more serious, a major crisis. I got through that phase, thankfully, with just a few minor scrapes. But as we progress through life, later in life, it seems very clear to me that crises of different kinds will appear, maybe serious illness. I'm sure many of you listening to this podcast today have experienced these things or have known people, loved ones, who have gone through things like cancer, heart attack, stroke, or some other form of major illness. And then, of course, there is the crisis of bereavement, the loss of a loved one. Divorce too, that is a misunderstood and very significant crisis. In my opinion, divorce is one of the most traumatic experiences a person can go through because it hits their very sense of identity. It hits people with forces that they're unprepared for. And in reality, nobody really wins in that situation. It appears to me that pretty much everyone in the family gets hurt. And in today's world, the crisis of losing a job is becoming increasingly common, and we're increasingly coming to understand how much of a crisis that can be for people. Reading a recent paper by a psychologist, he postulated that 80% of people who lose their job remain unemployed for at least 9 months, and over 20% of them end up divorced within 2 years. So it seems that's how traumatic and stressful something as common as a job loss can be. But the simple reality, friends, is that we will all face crises. In fact, some of you might be in the midst of a crisis right now. And if you're not, I assure you at some point you will face some sort of crisis in the future. So when that happens, when the crisis comes, how do you react? Do you panic? Do you fall apart? Do you fall over? That's the question we're going to consider today, how to handle life's crises. And that's what I'd like us to think about in today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Now today, friends, I want us to look through this passage, John chapter 18, the first 27 verses, which deals with the arrest and trial of Jesus Christ. Now, I've been through this passage 3, maybe 4 times before in our series together, so you have the opportunity to go and back and find it in the synoptic accounts where I look at the actual exposition of the narrative much more, rather than today, where I'm taking a different tack of looking at it to see what we can learn about a crisis, because it's dealing with the arrest and trial of Jesus, and clearly this was a crisis for him and for his apostles, his disciples. It certainly would have been something we might reasonably consider a crisis for Jesus himself, because he should never have been arrested in the first place. But remember, it was also a crisis for his followers, those who had just come finally to believe and settle fully on the fact that Jesus was the Messiah. So when he's arrested and tried as a common criminal, that would undoubtedly have been a crisis for them. So let's look at how he, Jesus himself, and his disciples, one of them in particular, handled this series of events. Now today's passage is naturally going to fall into three parts. I'm going to first of all look at the arrest of Christ in the first 11 verses of chapter 18. Then we look at the trial before Ananias and Peter's denial in verses 12 to 24. And then we'll round off by looking at another trial between Jesus before Caiaphas, which is in the closing couple of verses of the section we're looking at today. Now it's important to note that both Ananias and Caiaphas were Jewish leaders. So there are two Jewish trials of Christ going on here. Now from the Synoptic Gospels, and putting it together with John, we know that there were actually 6 trials, 6 cross-examinations in total between Jesus and his persecutors. 3 were Jewish and 3 were Roman. Today we're just focusing on his arrest and just 2 of the Jewish trials. Now in the opening verse we'll see the Lord voluntary to submit to his arrest. That's the key point that I believe John's emphasizing in what I'm about to read. And it's evident that Jesus knew what was happening and he willingly went through it. So the passage tells us, beginning in verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let those go their way. Let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus went to Peter, "Put your sword into your sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" I'll just pause there. First, let me say Jesus could have easily taken off and avoided this situation. There are at least 2 hours between Jesus dismissing Judas and him leaving the upper room and his arrest here in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus had plenty of time to flee the city, to escape even to another country, but he chose not to. Instead, he went to a place he visited regularly. Now Jesus, it tells us, met with a band of men and officers, those who had come from the chief priests and Pharisees, and they come with lanterns, torches, and weapons. And Jesus, knowing all of what was going to happen to him, actually steps forward and asks them, "Who is it you're seeking?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth," and Jesus says, "I am he." Now we note also from the text that Judas is standing with them, among them. But as soon as he says to them, "I am he," they are, or certainly the troop of soldiers, are seen to be compelled backwards, and it actually says some of them fall to the ground. So in these verses, we see that it is Judas himself who brought the soldiers to arrest him. And when they asked for Jesus, he identified himself. And by his use of the I am phrase, is identifying that he has the power to prevent his arrest if he wanted to. But he simply says, I am he. And the little word he in your Bible, if you look at it, you notice it is italicized, indicating that that part of it is not actually in the Greek text. It just helps us understand it grammatically in English, but what Jesus simply says in response to their question is he says, I am. So very clearly, again, echoing his God's own name, the name revealed to Moses at the burning bush, I am. So this passage shows that Jesus knew what was about to happen to him, but because of his deity, the deity of Christ, it also reveals that he has the power if he wished to escape this situation. Now, the band of soldiers here indicated as a troop in some of our modern translations is actually described using the Greek word spiria. So that suggests there are at least 200 soldiers here in the garden with them. And the moment Jesus says, I am, he's clearly demonstrating he has the power to prevent his arrest, symbolically displayed for us by the fact that they are literally knocked back, knocked over. So Jesus would appear to have control over this situation. Certainly in how he could respond to it, but his response is simply to step forward. He doesn't run away. He doesn't call down a legion of angels to wipe them out. Instead, he just calmly asks them again, who do you say you seek? And they say again, Jesus of Nazareth. And he responds by saying, I told you that I am he. So he's totally in control of the situation. And in fact, we see him calmly request that his disciples be allowed to leave. In these opening 9 verses, we simply see Jesus facing the main crisis of his life up to this point, and yet he voluntarily submits to those who are coming to arrest him. He knows what's coming. He had the power to stop it, but he's calm and composed. In fact, in response to Peter's violence, in verse 11, he simply tells Peter, the cup my Father hath given me, shall I not drink of it? He understood and accepted that it was God's will for these events to take place, for him to be arrested, tried, convicted, and as we know, eventually and very soon killed, crucified on a cross. Yet throughout that and with that foreknowledge, he still manifested a deep calmness throughout this entire ordeal. And I would say it doesn't matter how deep or difficult a crisis is, it is still possible for us to experience the peace of God, provided we too are simply willing to drink from the cup that he has given us. But the entire drama of his arrest isn't over yet. We note that we're given 2 images in response to this one incident, if you like. One we've seen from the Lord, who, knowing what is happening, even in light of the fact having the power to stop it, still voluntarily submits because he knew it was the will of his Father to do so. The other image that we're about to see is a response to the same crisis of the Apostle Peter. Well, at the point of Jesus' arrest, Peter, of course, does what he always does. He reacts impulsively. In verse 10, it talks about him actually drawing his sword and striking out and cutting off the high priest's servant's ear. And Jesus then just turns to Peter and says, put your sword back into its sheath, Peter. And he says this thing about, shall I not drink the cup which my Father is giving me? You can't fail to notice, if you've been with me on this journey, that Peter has in fact been repeatedly told that something like this was going to happen, yet he still seemed unprepared, and reacted violently, instead of just submitting in peace to the crisis that was unfolding before him. Now, unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that Peter's reaction is something perhaps most of us can relate to, understand, and are probably more likely to respond in a similar way. When faced with a crisis, our first response is often to react impulsively. but beware of reacting that way without thinking about it and what God might want to teach us in it. The picture of Jesus' arrest here, I believe, certainly in part, is meant to teach us that in all situations, crises included, that we should submit to God's will and do it calmly. So Peter's reaction is actually meant to serve as a warning. Reacting impulsively can lead to damage, harm, and even regret, and even take it down a path of future negative responses when facing crises. And we'll see that as the passage unfolds. Because now we're going to see the story of Peter's denial and then moving into Jesus' trial before Ananias. So let's continue with the text. I'm going to read from verses 12 to 18. So it tells us that this detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrest Jesus, and they bound him. And they led him away to Ananias, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Then the text, carry on with the text. Then we see Peter denying Jesus. Verse 15, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went and spoke to her, who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, are you not one of these men's disciples? Peter said, I am not. Now the servants and officers who made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. And just pushing through the next verses, we see the beginning of Jesus being questioned by the high priest. Verses 19 to 24, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where Jews always meet, and also in secret, and I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, if I had spoken evil, bear witness of this evil. But if well, then why do you strike me? Then Ananias sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, so in these verses, we're now moving into the trial of Jesus himself before Ananias. Now, Ananias is an intriguing figure. He was actually high priest previously from 7 to 14 AD, so up to about just less than 20 years prior to this, he had that role. But after him, his sons and his son-in-law then subsequently became high priests. And it's Caiaphas, his son-in-law, who holds the position now, making this little group of people, Ananias, one of the most powerful families and individuals in Jerusalem among the Jews at that time. So even though Ananias himself is no longer high priest, he still holds significant influence by the fact he's handed down these positions of power through his family. So when Jesus is brought to this guy, Ananias, the retired high priest, it is a purely political act. Ananias at that point had no jurisdiction. He'd no right to actually try Jesus, yet despite this, Jesus is taken to see him, and the events around the venue of this questioning is where we see Peter's denial play out. So when Jesus is taken to Ananias, to his place, a girl confronts Peter in the courtyard outside and says, aren't you one of this man's disciple? Now remember, often this is studied in isolation. You don't get the flow through from what's just happened. Remember, Peter has just demonstrated his impulsive willingness to defend Jesus to the death by striking a soldier with his sword. And now, moments later, he's denying knowing him. The contrast is staggering if you read it all in one go. Moments before, Peter was ready to fight 200 soldiers, it would seem, but now he's overcome and capitulates by a simple question from a servant girl. This highlights for me an absolutely critical point, being that sometimes when you think you're strong, you're at your most vulnerable. Peter's bravado vanishes in a moment in the face of what is a relatively minor challenge. And scripture reminds us in other places that when we think we stand firm, that is when we need to beware, for that is when we are most likely to fall. Now, in contrast to Peter's response to a crisis, when we see Jesus standing before Ananias, remember, could have called down legions of angels to rescue him, but instead he calmly chooses to submit to his Father's will. And Ananias questions Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus responds brilliantly by simply stating, "You have all the evidence you need. I have spoken openly in the public many times. Go and speak to the people who've heard me speak and ask what I've said." Now, if you want to look at the text of what he said in more detail, I suggest you go back and look at my analysis, my exposition of this passage in the Synoptic Gospels. But today we don't have time for that. I'm just drawing attention to the fact that he challenges Aeneas to ask those who've already heard what he says. So he's adhering actually to the Jewish legal procedure of the time, which Aeneas would have fully recognized, that if he was to accuse him of anything, then he was required to bring and appear a minimum of 2 witnesses, and they should be questioned first. So Jesus is simply saying, everything I've said is out there in the public domain. Come, bring your witnesses, bring your evidence. At this point, unusually, one of the high priest's servants' reaction to this is simply to strike Jesus. And Jesus then calmly says to him, "If I've spoken wrongly, bear witness to the wrong. But if I've spoken rightly and truly, then why are you striking me?" This to me exemplifies this idea of Jesus both holding his majesty and what is called in the Bible his meekness together at one time in complete unity. He has the power always to defend himself, but chooses with free will to submit even to those who abuse him, thus fulfilling his Father's will. And in this passage, we see a clear contrast between Peter's denial and Jesus' submission. Jesus is in this place of displaying majesty and meekness together. He stands firm. He's fully aware of his power, yet he's fully aware of his Father's will. So he chooses to endure suffering. And this, I would suggest, should remind you and I that in a time of crisis, we should always aspire to align ourselves with God's will, always trying to maintain our composure and faith rather than in reacting impulsively out of fear, as we're often impulsively likely to do. Now, the closing verses of the passage we're looking at today, we'll see Peter deny him twice more, but then we'll see this great contrast of the majesty and meekness of Jesus Christ. Let me just read a couple of verses for you. Now Simon Peter, he stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, Are not you also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter had cut off, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Then Peter denied, and immediately a rooster crowed. So that's the denial. But let me just focus for a moment on the idea of Jesus is standing before Caiaphas out here. All this is going on in the courtyard outside. Jesus is probably in the building, a substantial building of this rich and influential man, being cross-examined, and he's responded in the way I've just said. And in this response, in this cross-examination, I think we again, and not for the first time in Scripture, see the contrast between his majesty and his meekness. There are many examples of this. For instance, he was born a helpless baby in a manger, yet angels announced his birth. He appeared in the most modest places on earth. A manger in an animal shed, barn, or cave. But yet a star led wise men from afar and inspired them to bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. He submitted to the baptism of John the Baptist, yet the heavens opened up that same baptism and a voice proclaimed, "This is my beloved Son." He sat weary and thirsty beside a well, didn't he? And he asked a peasant woman to give him water to drink, and yet he was the one who offered and gave her the power of the water of life. We saw him sleep from exhaustion in a small fishing boat, yet he awoke and commanded the storm to be still. He wept beside an open grave, yet he had the power to call the same person in that grave back to life. We see other gospel accounts that he sweats blood in the agony of the garden, yet an angel will come from heaven and strengthen him. And he stands here and will stand again many times as a prisoner before human judges, yet he is the one appointed to judge the world. And he had died in apparent defeat, yet in that very hour of defeat was in fact his greatest triumph, glorifying himself and bringing men and women back to God. This juxtaposition of majesty and meekness always strikes me deeply because it shows that ultimately submission to the will of God, no matter what the circumstances might appear to worldly onlookers, is not a sign of weakness. Now, I've explained it several times before when we've stumbled across this phrase meekness in other passages. The Greek word translated for us as meekness doesn't really come across well in our way our modern minds think of someone who is meek, because the original word means strength under control. The Father, as Jesus says, has given Jesus a cup to drink, and he has submitted to it, and he submits to it with immense strength and grace. And that is the type of meekness we're talking about. It's strength, resilience to stand firm and not to waver under control. So Aeneas' response to all this is to send him tied up, bound, to send him to Caiaphas, the current high priest, and there Jesus will stand trial again. And during all this, Peter is outside simply trying to warm himself by the fire. And it's where we see this question where another person out there says, "Are you not one of his disciples?" And Peter denies it, saying, "No, I'm not." One of the high priest's servants, who's a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him and said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" And Peter denies it again, and immediately we see the rooster crows three times. And that's fulfilling a prediction that Peter would deny him 3 times. That's more fully explained in the other gospel accounts. If you want more detail on my perspective on that, go seek it out there. You've got to remember this is the 4th time we've approached some of these stories in our journey through the Bible. Here I'm focusing on the stark contrast. Jesus bound and on trial before Caiaphas on one hand, yet calmly, willingly submitting to God's will. And thereby, as a polar opposite of that, we see Peter denying his association, reacting impulsively out of fear, yet the Lord stands firm, and Peter, he's the one who falters. Now, it's 3 times in this passage we see Jesus voluntarily submitting to the will of God, and in contrast, Peter swings from impulsive daring to complete emphatic denial and repeating that denial. So both of them, you might say, are in some sort of crisis, but the responses are worlds apart and are there to be a contrast for us to recognize and to try and learn from them. Jesus responds properly to the will of God, while Peter reacts, well, ultimately out of fear and self-preservation. We need to learn from this, I believe. We need to try and let Jesus be our example, not look on Peter, use it for an insight into our human nature, but not follow Peter's example. When crises come, we need to recognize also and see them as cups the Father has given us to drink. And by following Jesus' example and using that to guide our response, we in fact please our Heavenly Father. We fulfill His will. We can even experience a degree of peace in the midst of such turmoil. But if we follow Peter's example, we just ultimately risk damaging ourselves and other people's. Therefore, it is imperative that in a crisis we simply do what Jesus did and submit to the will of God. And by doing so, I believe that this passage tells us that we can and will indeed be blessed, and that others will benefit from it, even in the midst of helping them deal with their crises. Instead of being like Peter and lashing out and harming others around us, we are able to bring God's peace and understanding of His will and purpose into those situations. Ultimately, submission to the will of God in a crisis and perhaps just doing nothing more than saying, I'm leaving it to God, is revealed here as not just beneficial, but essential for our spiritual well-being. Now, I know many of you are listening to that and you might be thinking, yeah, but you don't know what I'm going through, and it's not an easy thing to do. How do you submit to the will of God when you really are in a crisis? And it's a valid question, and it's something that challenges me to this day to try and use this as my model, my inspiration. But I personally believe that the ability to submit to God's will in a crisis is not something that can be easily produced on the spot. I accept that, but I do believe it can come about as a result of living a life in submission to God. In other words, if you're living the Christian life, then you're cultivating a life of submission, full stop. You're living a life where you choose to submit to God's will, to be obedient to His word, and that perspective will show up for you in a crisis. I really believe that. You see, crises reveal, and ultimately they reveal your spiritual character. What you do when you're in a crisis, it will be what you have been becoming in your wider life. And if you've been submitting to the will of God on a daily basis, you will be growing spiritually. You will be getting mature. You will be being strengthened, and you will be becoming strong in the Lord. Meaning that when you face a crisis, and it will inevitably come, you will have both the experience and the ability to do or to continue to do what you have hopefully habitually been doing on a more subtle level for years. And that is simply submitting to the will of God. If throughout your life you've reacted to the little crises by trusting in the Lord, then you're much better equipped to react in the same way when the major crisis comes along, aren't you? So I believe the ultimate answer to how you respond in a crisis in life lies in how you've been responding to them in your life. Listen, friends, there is a crisis coming in all our lives. Now, I know we don't like to think about it. We prefer to focus on other things. But let me tell you, a great test is inevitable, and it comes to us all. If you live in a loving, secure, happy marriage, then, friends, one day, one of you is going to follow the other, to follow that ambulance or follow the other to a hospital bed and have the crisis of seeing the one you most love and care for die first. Or you yourself might be the one who succumbs to that illness. So be sure, friends, please be sure of the inevitability of facing a crisis and the benefit of living the godly life. Because when the time comes, you will fall, and you will fall in one of two ways. You will fall upon the Lord, or you will fall in the direction you have already been leaning. So if you've been submitting yourself to the will of God, and if you've been submitting to Him daily, then when the crisis comes, when any crisis comes, you will fall upon Him, as you always have. But if you haven't been doing like that, then like sadly we see the Apostle Peter do here, you'll fall away. So this passage teaches us that we are to prepare ourselves for the big events in life by submitting to the Lord to the small events in our daily lives. And if we don't, we will not be able to respond properly. But if we do, we will respond properly. And the promise here is that we will be blessed and that it will benefit others. So the lesson, I believe, today in this passage, or the one that I want to draw our attention to among many that can be found, is that it tells you and I to be about the business of submitting to the living God. By doing that, when any crisis comes, then you will be prepared for it, because you have built your life upon the sure foundation of daily submission to Him. And doing so will not only bring you a sense of peace and blessing in the everyday, but in every situation that you might have to face in your own life. But it also, friends, will enable you to be a source of strength and support to others in their time of need, if they're going through the same type of crisis that you've already been. And what a benefit that is to you and to others. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, friends, welcome to today's episode. Today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. You're very welcome whether you're here for the first time or you've been here from the beginning. Now, you will know if you've been here with me for a while that we've been pretty rapidly moving through the Gospel of John, and we've now reached this famous trial and crucifixion of Jesus. Today, in the passages we're going to be covering, which is John 18:28 through to 19 verse 16, where you're going to look at Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. John will address this at length, likely because many people at the time John wrote this account had questions themselves, because they just heard that Jesus undergone this trial and execution as a criminal. So that's what we're going to look at today. Consider how we react alongside how those people react, and what these events really meant. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, podcasts. Now, before addressing and examining this passage, one thing I want you to know. You will notice that the Jews refused to enter the fortress of Pontius Pilate. You'll see, rather strangely perhaps, that they stay outside and Pilate has to go back and forth between talking to Jesus inside and addressing the Jewish leader outside. So the focus shifts and switches. It's almost like scene after scene in a play, but Pilate is the central figure in each and every one of these scenes, and he is the key guy who plays a crucial role in the unfolding events. And through what we see in him, we have a real insight into how us and to how the world view and weigh Jesus and the message he brought. Perhaps this is why this scene or series of scenes so perfectly fit into so many movie versions of the narrative of the life of Christ. But the central focus in what we're going to look at is Pilate and his reaction and response before everything. It's going to play a crucial role in the unfolding events I'm going to read to you this morning. The verse after the one we finished at yesterday, and we're going to read through to chapter 18, verse 37, which tells us this. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. But now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus has said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and the chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth, and everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Now remember, it points out that these events are taking place just before the Passover, and according to the original Jewish tradition, people could not partake in the Passover if they had been ceremonially defiled with what was called leaven, yeast. Now, leaven was believed to represent sin. It was the rising agent in bread, the thing that caused bread to fill up, and in Jewish topography, it pictorially represents sin in the fact that the core of all sin lies the pride of the heart. That which causes us to puff up ourselves and make us the center of our decision making, not God. That is the heart of sin, which is why leaven represents it so much in Jewish thing. Well, that was the principle, but by this time the Jews had extended this rule, making it not even possible to enter a house that might even have the possibility of having any leaven in it. Now, assuming Pontius Pilate's house was that of a Gentile, that would probably mean it would have leaven in it, or would have had leaven in it at some point. So they refused to go inside his official residence in Jerusalem to speak to him. That's what these verses are indicating. Now you will notice also, perhaps if you look closely, it says it was early in the morning. The word used in the Greek text means it says it was the fourth watch of night, meaning it was very early, probably between 3 and 5 or 6 a.m. We also should note that a Roman court could not convene until after sunrise, yet despite the early hours and the darkness, the Jews gather outside, they refuse to go in, they stay outside, and they're demanding a trial during the night. Pilate then goes out to them and says, well, what's the accusation you bring against this man? So Pilate is in a sense playing the part of the judge, but he wants some sort of formal statement from them of the charges they're trying to make against Jesus. I think it's fair to say he likely knew some of the accusations due to his everyday ongoing prior dealing with Jewish leaderships at that time. So he'd probably heard about Jesus, but what he wants now from them is a clear and formal declaration of any charges they want to bring. Now it almost looks like the Jews are surprised by this question. They're unprepared to bring a formal charge. They just simply say, well, if he's not a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you. That's a very vague response, and it indicates their assumption that Pilate should just take their word and do as they say without further inquiry. But Pilate's response to them is, no, you take him and judge him according to your own laws. So the Jews are now in a very difficult spot, because now they have to admit what they're actually looking to bring about. They're not able to take him away because they could only bring some minor charge against them under their Roman governorship. They weren't allowed to do anything under the Roman law to bring a serious charge against them, certainly nothing that would warrant death, but yet they wanted Jesus dead. That's beyond their jurisdiction. They can't carry out anything that might, as an end result, mean capital punishment. So they openly reveal their true motivation by what they say next, by simply saying it's not lawful for us to put any man to death. John then adds the comment that this admission fulfills Jesus' prophecy about the manner of his death. You see, Jesus, you may remember, has already predicted that he would be crucified, lifted up, as he stated in John 12:32 and 33. That we looked at previously when we covered that passage, but that was something that only Romans could do. So Pilate, still without seeing any formal charge being brought against Jesus, turns to interrogate him himself. In verse 33, Pilate enters what's called the judgment hall and asks Jesus the straightforward question, are you the King of the Jews? Now, instead of directly answering, we see Jesus ask him in return, is that your question, or in effect did other people put you up to it? And Pilate himself is unprepared for this response,
and flustered, he simply asks, it says, "Am I a Jew? It is your own people, the chief priests, who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" And Jesus' reply is very simply but profoundly, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." Now, that may be a profound statement, but it just seemed to confuse Pilate. A kingdom not of this world was beyond his understanding as a secular official, but it certainly stimulated his curiosity. Pilate's encounter with Jesus was challenging his perception of what true power and kingdom really meant. He's introducing a spiritual realm to this whole discussion, what Pilate is grasping but not really comprehending at this point. So Pilate then says to Jesus, "So you are a king then?" And Jesus answers, "If I say that I'm a king, well, the fact is, I was born and came into the world with the idea to proclaim the truth, and everyone on the side of truth will listen to me." So Jesus is standing before Pontius Pilate, and he declares that he is using his kingly mission, and that being to bear witness to the truth. This proclamation by Jesus, many consider one of the high points of the Gospel of John. We've seen Jesus recognized before in different ways. Right back in chapter 1, Nathanael recognized Jesus as the king then, as King of the Jews. And now before Pilate, Jesus affirms that he is indeed a king, one born, but with the purpose to proclaim the King of the universe, proclamation to the world of testifying to the truth, which is found in him, his life, his ministry, and what we know will subsequently become his death and resurrection. And everyone who is aligned with that truth will understand his voice, he says. In verse 38, Pilate responds to all this by the amazing response. He says, "Well, what is truth?" Now, this question has been interpreted in various ways over the years. Many have said it is the beginning and most profound declaration of moral relativism, or just some others say, no, he's just plain confused by it all. Regardless of Pilate's tone, it's clear he does not receive or even wait for Jesus to answer that. He just makes that statement, what is truth anyway? And then immediately after that, he's seen to go out again to the Jews and actually say to them, "I find no fault in him at all." So Pilate, in a sense, has completed his initial interrogation. He doesn't really perhaps get to the depths of understanding what Jesus is talking about, but he understands enough to make his decision, and he finds no basis for a charge against Jesus. He includes there is no reason for punishment of or no crime of any nature that he can see. But then round 2 of this trial begins in the latter part of verse 38 and will continue through to John. Let's just read it in sections. So let's close off chapter 18 now. Verse 38, "What is the truth?" reported Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews, gathered there, and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at this time of Passover. Do you want me to release this King of the Jews?" And the crowd shout back, "No, no, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. So Pilate, he's outside now again. He's addressing the Jewish leadership gathered outside and the crowd that have now gathered as dawn and daylight comes. And he reiterates his findings he says he sees no fault in Jesus. Now, the other gospel accounts suggest that someone in the crowd actually proposed releasing a prisoner as per the custom. The custom involved releasing a criminal during the run-up to Passover as a sign of compassion and mercy of the state as occupiers, which the Jews acknowledged and participated as well. And the proposal of Barabbas is made. Now, more details of all this are found in the other gospel accounts, and I unpack it more there. But by doing this, I see what Pilate is trying to do is he's seeking out a way of trying to diffuse this situation, and he initially offers to release Jesus, whom he calls the King of the Jews. However, the crowd, definitely whipped up and influenced by the religious leaders, reject Jesus and instead demand the release of this guy Barabbas. John adding that little note of context for us, saying that Barabbas was a robber. Now, the Greek word used here, it's more than might spring into your mind as naturally thinking, oh, he's talking about someone who's a thief. It was actually a word that meant someone's by their actions and their illegal activity was actually an insurrectionist, indicating that Barabbas was much more than a thief, but he's a rebel, an insurrectionist. Some might even say terrorist who had committed murder in his actions. And the crowd here, manipulated by the leaders, they choose Barabbas, even though they had the offer of someone innocent to release before them. Let me continue with the first 5 verses of chapter 9. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Now all of this is probably an attempt to appease the crowd initially, but now he hands Jesus over to be flogged, and the soldiers' actions are filled with cruel irony. They mock Jesus, the true King of Kings, by going through this parody of a sort of royal investiture. The passage highlights the stark contrast between Jesus' dignity and the injustice he's having to endure here, despite being the fact he is indeed the rightful king and the embodiment of truth. He is subject to this untruthful sham trial, cruel mockery and physical abuse. And Pilate stands here, caught between his understanding, his recognition of Jesus' innocence of the charges brought against him and the pressure of the crowd. And he sort of becomes a reluctant participant in what we would today clearly call a miscarriage of justice. The Jewish leaders, driven by envy, driven by fear, manipulate this man and this situation to achieve their goal of having Jesus condemned to death. Yet through it all, Jesus remains steadfast, fulfilling his mission to bear witness to the truth and to ultimately, as we know, offer himself as a sacrificial lamb for the sins of the world. Pilate, we see here, he again comes out to the crowd and says, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you. I find no fault in him." But remember, Pilate is now showing Jesus, bringing him out. He's still wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Many suggest, and I agree, that Pilate hopes is perhaps this vision of a beaten and bruised Jesus will in some way elicit some degree of sympathy and perhaps sway the crowd from demanding further punishment. It's also important to note, I believe, that Pilate uses the direct declaration, "Behold the man," not "Behold the king" this time, because I believe he wants the crowd to see Jesus not as a threat, but as at most a pitiable figure, one who does not deserve to be put to death. Anyway, let's see what happens and how it works out. Picking up at verse 6, it says, "Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' And Pilate said to them, 'You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him.' The Jews answered, 'We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God.' Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was more afraid, and went out into the praetorium, and said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?' Jesus answered, 'You could have no power at all against me, unless it had been given to you from above.'" Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you're not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." And when Pilate therefore heard them saying, he brought Jesus out and sat him down in the judgment seat. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. So despite Pilate's attempt, from this verse 6 forward to 16, it tells us that when the chief priests and officers see Jesus, they simply cry out again and again, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate responds to their frustration and in effect says, "You crucify them because I still find no fault in him." So Pilate is essentially stating that there's no legal reason that he has to condemn Jesus in this way, and again is trying to pass the responsibility back to the Jews. But the Jewish leadership cleverly escalate their accusation, turning it by nature against him, saying, "We have a law, and according to the law he ought to die because he's declared himself the Son of God." So this declaration intensifies the situation for Pilate. He's now becoming more afraid because the charge of claiming to be the Son of God carries significant weight, not just religiously in the Jewish terms, but politically for the Roman state as well. Pilate's fear grows as he contemplates the gravity of the situation. In the other gospel accounts, we have his anxiety added to by his wife's dreaming about this situation and her worries. So Pilate again returns to Jesus and asks him, "Well, where are you from?" But Jesus now is just remaining silent. Pilate doesn't get it. He's baffled by Jesus' silence. No matter what he says, Jesus is quiet, like a lamb being led to the slaughter. Now, there's an important principle to see in this that I sometimes think is overlooked. In this, I see the principle of the fact that sometimes God remains silent where an answer that we need to receive is already evident. You should know what God's view on something is. Sometimes we go to him asking for something when we know in no way would it be in his plan or will for us. So sometimes God remains silent when the answer is already plainly evident, or when the individual is not genuinely seeking the truth. So when Pilate pressurizes Jesus, he actually does so by saying, "Don't you know who I am? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you or to crucify you this day?" And Jesus simply replies, "You have no authority over me unless it has already been given to you from above." So Pilate is stuck here on the horns of a real dilemma. He does want to release Jesus, but the Jews are playing into his fear of losing favour with Caesar. His position was tenuous at the best anyway, and they say, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend." Everyone who makes himself a king by nature opposes Caesar. Now this statement and the way they're escalating this situation, it really hits a raw nerve. Pilate knows he can't afford to be disloyal to Caesar because it won't end well for him. And in verse 13, Pilate makes his final decision. He brings Jesus out, sits him on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd, and almost sarcastically, I think this time, he says, "Behold your king." And the crowd, remember, who've been incited by the chief priests and the Pharisees, they respond with, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate asks, "Shall I crucify your king?" So he wants a confirmation here. And the chief priests answer, "Yes, we have no king but Caesar." And Pilate then delivers Jesus finally to be crucified. The conclusion of this passage is clear. Jesus is innocent, yet Pilate, after 3 rounds of interrogation, cross-questioning, finding no fault in him at any point, yet still driven by fear and political pressure, allows Jesus to be crucified. I think this decision highlights for all of us a crucial warning about prioritizing any temporal concerns over spiritual truths, because when we do that, friends, it can lead to devastating consequences. Pilate's fear of losing his position outweighed his acknowledgement of Jesus' innocence, his understanding of Jesus is innocent, and led him to actively participate in what we would today call a miscarriage of justice. But we can learn from this example. We can learn from the fact that Pilate failed to stand up for what was right, and he did do so for fear of worldly repercussions. When we do that, that not only harms the cause of Christ, but it also leads to our own personal downfall, even ruin. Pilate's ultimate fate is fulfilled for us when it's reported later by historians that he committed suicide less than a decade after this event. This, for me, underscores the potential destructive path of choosing earthly security over spiritual integrity. In all our decision-making, it's essential to recognize the shortness of time alongside the vastness of the eternity we face. Let's not make the mistake of Pontius Pilate by allowing any immediate fears and concerns to overshadow eternal truths and values. The result of all of this, the result of this wrong decision by Pilate, is that Jesus, the King, is going to be nailed to a cross. Verse 17 and 19 tell us, and he, that's Jesus, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is Golgotha, where they crucified him and two others with him, one on either side, Jesus in the centre. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. John's Gospel gets to the core of what happens very quickly here. The innocence of Christ has just been displayed, and the guilt of humanity is now displayed for all to see in the events that follow on. As I reflect in this passage and the line I've taken through it, this time, it's the fourth time we've encountered the crucifixion of Christ through the Gospel accounts. This time, I think the path has led me to one profound spiritual truth that particularly stands out for me today. The fact that Jesus, though innocent, died with criminals and as a criminal. The innocent one who was found guiltless by Pilate, yet still bore the sin of man and was crucified unjustly. Now, John's Gospel does not delve into the detail of this in the same manner as the other Gospel accounts do, but the broader biblical narrative, if we read the other Gospel accounts and also the New Testament letters, remind us constantly of the significance of these events and what has happened here in the way John has portrayed it. The Apostle Paul, in 2 Corinthians 5:21, encapsulates the nub of this truth for us when he said, "He who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him." The essence of the story is that an innocent man died to pay the price of the sin of all humanity. The Apostle Peter also emphasized this in his writing, stating that the just died for the unjust and died so that he might bring us to God. This is the great fundamental truth of our faith, friends. Jesus Christ was sinless. Jesus Christ was without flaw. Yet he also took upon himself the punishment that the guilty deserve. And the biblical record, inspired by the Spirit of God, asserts again and again and again that each and every one of us is indeed guilty, and that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So consider this for a moment. The record of Christ's innocence is juxtaposed here before us, and we're meant to draw the line to our guilt, our personal guilt. It should be stark, and when we see that truth, we gain that insight. It should be the thing that humbles us. Jesus, the innocent one, the one who should not die, died. And we, the guilty, the one who deserved death, the one who should, like Barabbas, have died for our transgressions, by the grace of God have been allowed to go free. An innocent man died so the guilty could go free. That's the heart of the Christian message. And that's the thing that lies at the heart of this trial and cross-examination of Jesus Christ with Pilate. That's the whole point I believe he's trying to get over here. We're meant to see innocence contrasted with guilt and corruption, underscoring for us the depth of the sacrifice he made, because it lies in those extremes of the worst possible thing happening to the best possible man. Barabbas, he was clearly guilty. He was a criminal, a robber, an insurrectionist. Yet because of Jesus, Barabbas walked free. This incident again encapsulates the essence of the gospel, the meaning of the gospel, in that the innocent Christ takes the place of the guilty so that all may be free. So, friends, an innocent man, no, the Son of God, took the place of the guilty. Jesus took our place, your place, my place on the cross. This should lead us to a deep sense of gratitude and cause us to reflect on the immense sacrifice he has made for us. But the warning of Pilate remains: do not sacrifice eternal values for temporal, secular concerns. Prioritize the spiritual over the secular. Prioritize the eternal over the immediate. Learn from Pilate's mistake. Learn from Jesus' example, and don't let the shortness of time outweigh the vastness of eternity. Value the eternal over the temporary. Jesus Christ's trial and crucifixion reminds us of the ultimate sacrifice that he made for our sins, and we are called to embrace this truth and let it transform our lives, and let that truth guide your actions and the decisions you make every day, each and every day, away from temporal, worldly things to the eternal, spiritual things of God. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, we leave it there, friends. I do hope I'll see you back here again tomorrow on the Bible Project Daily podcast. This project is for you and I together to study and work through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. You can subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. By doing so, it won't cost a penny, but you'll be able to make sure you get a notification by your podcast provider every time a new episode is dropped. You can reach out and connect to me. There's a place called Patreon, which is a community of people who have come alongside and want to be more involved in this project and connect to me personally, and that's called Patreon. There's a link to go and join that Patreon community over there. It doesn't cost a penny to just join and follow, and by doing that you will have the ability to ask a question or to get into a conversation with me, but also you have access to loads of additional free resources. Each episode I put in episode notes, I put a study guide up, I even put a sermon outline in case you wanted to use this material to create a sermon or a message of your own, as well as a full transcript of the text. All of it is there to help you, I hope, and support you. It's all free and copyright free for you to use in whatever way you want, as long as you believe you are called to use it to build up God's kingdom and build up your own ministry in the world. There are ways in which you can also partner with this ministry over there, and by doing that, I do put up some bonus episodes every couple of weeks. Oh, and by the way, on Patreon, you have, if you want, by subscribing, you will have early notification and access to an ad-free version of the podcast if you want. So check us out over there if you've got a moment, and you'll see all the other stuff I'm doing outside the main two podcasts, which are the Bible Project Daily podcast and my less frequent History of the Christian Church. My attempt to create a history-based podcast but tells the story of the church as the work of the Holy Spirit through the minds and actions of individuals throughout church history. Anyway, it's all over there. I hope you find it all helpful. I hope you're finding that this journey together through the Word is transforming your life. I know it is mine, and I do trust I'll see you back here again tomorrow, or very soon, because you're free to do this at whatever pace suits you. But I'll see you very soon, I trust, on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.